Good evening. Welcome to our sixth Psychosocial Wednesday. It's July 2020. I'm very happy to have John Beebe for us tonight. John Beebe and I met only last year in Flesh and Bones while we were in Wrocław in Poland at a conference. But actually, I met him back in 2003 when I was a student at Cambridge, and I met him via his book on masculinity. I bought that book on a sale shop, actually, and I didn't read it until 5 years ago. But it was very nice to have that book with me, even before I started my Jungian journey. As I said, tonight is our sixth meeting, our sixth salon. And I'm very happy to have John here as one of the new ancestors. Some of you know that I've been working on a publishing project called The New Ancestors. And he's actually an anthology of contemporary classic in analytical psychology. Will be a book hopefully published in 1 year or so by an important publishing house. And there will be 28 ancestors. So who are the new ancestors? This is a question that I ask you, and that I asked myself in the past few months. As of August, we will move to 1 month only salon. So in August, we will have Joel Crocker. In September, we will have Mark Wimber. In October, we will have Monica Lucci. In November, we will have Joe Cambray. And in December, we will have Nancy Krieger. We're working on the new concept for next year, so we are putting together thoughts on who to invite. Please feel free to suggest us who you would like to hear. Don't forget, in November, we will also have Sonu Shandasani talking about the Black Books. But tonight, John is going to talk about the mana, personality, and after. And making a joke with him, I said, do I really need to introduce you? Well, everyone knows John. He's one of the most senior, most important new ancestor in the Jungian field. But let me say officially a few words about him. He is the author of what I consider a masterpiece, his masterpiece, Integrity in Depth, and Energies and Patterns in Psychological Type, The Reservoir of Consciousness. He's the co-author with Virginia Apperson of The Presence of the Feminine in Film. John is also known for his work on archetypes in political culture, divination with the I Ching, and the role of the trickster in creativity and individuation. He is obviously a Jungian analyst in private practice in San Francisco. John, I give you now the word. I don't know how many are we, 75, this is great. So we will start now, or John will give us his talk, and then please send us your questions. Thank you.
I'm always glad to hear an introduction of myself. You know, Jung gave an interview that's really kind of notorious and very unsatisfactory to so many of us in 1933 on Radio Berlin, in which he noted that at that particular moment, a time of the Führer had come to Germany. Many people have been very unhappy that Jung ever said these words, but he did say something that everyone has ignored in that otherwise very unsatisfactory broadcast, which didn't make him any friends. It didn't make him deserve the enemies he got, but it was nevertheless unfortunate because he wasn't critical, as Jung tended not to be sometimes in the face of a new archetypal phenomenon. He got a few stars in his eyes just because he was seeing an archetype. He didn't tell you exactly how he felt about the archetype, and so you got the sense that he was excited by the presence of an archetype. But having said that the hour of the Führer had come, he also said, but you know, if the Führer doesn't know himself, that could be a problem. Now, he said it in a very sotto voce way that you could almost miss his saying it. But for me, despite my anathema, toward the side of Jung that didn't immediately see, as I would have loved Jung to have seen, that just because we have an archetype doesn't mean we don't also have a disaster. He would say that, but he didn't. He would say, well, it's like an avalanche. But sometimes you had the feeling that he was so willing to let things happen with his newly won principle of Wu Wei, letting things happen, that he wanted to let archetypes happen. In fact, in those days, he and Emma Jung in their house in Kusnacht had a garden, and he had the idea that everything in the garden should be absolutely allowed to grow exactly the way it wanted to. Now, he had an introverted sensation wife, Emma Jung, who was a very good Swiss gardener, and she knew that the weeds can quickly choke out the good flowers. And she had one hell of a fight with Jung over years, Joseph Henderson, who knew them at that time, because he was in analysis with Jung in 1930, and he was later my analyst, told me that she had a terrible time getting Jung to realize that you can't have a garden without pulling out weeds. You can't just let things grow naturally. But the Jung who had discovered the idea of a self in 1928 and 1929, when it starts appearing in his writings, particularly in the second of the two essays on analytical psychology, and also in the important paper on psychic energy, was so interested in getting the ego out of the way and letting the self take over, that he had a certain fascination. But even by the time he gave the interview in 1933, he already recognized the danger, despite what he was doing with his garden, he did recognize the danger of a leader that was very much in touch with the unconscious in some way of his nation and could somehow ride that awareness to a stage of leadership and power, might well be the quote man of the hour. But if that leader confuses what he may know about the unconscious with what he doesn't know about himself, and of course when Jung said himself, he means the self, all kinds of problems can come. So in that very subtle voce saying, but if the leader doesn't know himself. Now, as far as we know, Jung imagined, like many people, that Hitler was a temporary problem that would self-correct, and that the normal things would be restored. And so he thought that nature has an ecological balance. I think that's giving far too much energy to nature, and much too, and Jung in his later writings admitted that nature is often unkind, and Stefano and I have talked about this online in relation to the compensatory aspect of the COVID crisis and how cruel nature can be in one of these compensatory moments. So relying on the unconscious is actually a rather dangerous strategy. And for that, we have to go to Jung's subject of the mana personality. It was a term that he adopted from a developing anthropology of his time, which has already had its day and its day has passed, in which terms like mana could be taken from Polynesia and then turned into Western concepts with very different meaning. This whole subject has always interested me since I first read the two essays in analytical psychology. And there comes a moment when, after the person learning slowly to relate to the unconscious, as Jung presents it in his second essay on the relations between the ego and the unconscious, comes to terms gradually, first with their persona, then with their shadow, then with the anima and the animus. And around that time, they really think they know a great deal. That's a very dangerous time in Jungian analysis, and more than one person that I've known has fallen victim to the assumption that because they've had some developing awareness of things in themselves that create projections and things in themselves that cloud their consciousness with complexes, that they know so much that they're no longer at the mercy of the unconscious. And it's precisely at that point that Jung says one feels that one is, so to speak, conquered the unconscious. And it's at that point that a very old principle that when you've slain something or you feel that you've come to the end of something, everything that troubled you before with its uncanny power no longer troubles you. You've, so to speak, slain that dragon, but its power, its energy, everything that had once fascinated you or made you frightened suddenly rushes up into your ego. And at that point, you think you have it made, and your mana, as the Polynesians would call it, is now the mana that once belonged to everything that inhibited you, everything that confused you, everything that made you fall in love with the wrong person, everything that didn't work out, all the missteps that people make when their unconscious has too much power. Now the fantasy is that one's past all of that because thanks to the wonders of modern psychology, one knows about the persona and the shadow and the anima and the animus. And so therefore one can relax. Actually, it's the most dangerous moment of all. And that's the moment at which one has, as Nietzsche said long before Jung, and Jung was aware of this, there has been a self-overcoming. You've overcome that self that at one time was getting in your way. And what you don't know is that you still have ahead the even bigger task of overcoming your self-overcoming. And that's where Jung talks about this in 1928 and 29 in his essays on the mana personality, using this term from Polynesia. So you have to know what mana is to understand what it means to think one has conquered the unconscious and to think one now has the power it once had over you. So the term mana first entered the West with Captain Cook back in the end of the 18th century when he first learned about it, and it was bandied about for 100 years after that. But at the end of the 19th century, a man named Codrington wrote a book on the Melanesians, and he talked about mana in such an interesting way. The way mana is talked about is sometimes the way I heard Aretha Franklin once explain what soul is on the Johnny Carson show. And she explained that you might just have an old pair of shoes, and that old pair of shoes, you just can't get rid of them because those shoes have soul. So you just look at them every day, you can see the soul in the shoes. Well, that's very close to the way the Melanesians talked about the mana of things. I've always been interested in how certain things speak to you. And so when I heard Aretha Franklin talking about this, I felt I really understood what Jung meant by mana. And it also made me think of how much I love some of Van Gogh's pictures of shoes and how much mana is in the shoes that he paints and so forth. So I can easily relate to the Melanesian idea that things themselves have their soul properties. The usual anthropological assumption that this is a form of animism in which we're really anthropomorphizing or putting human psyche into. I don't agree with that anymore, but the anthropologists were very interested in what this meant to people, that things had power, and often the power accrued to whom they belonged to. Obviously, we get interested in Van Gogh's shoes because they belong to Van Gogh, and so a genius's shoes fascinate us as he paints them with all they meant to him because we want to step into the shoes the genius ourselves as we watch his painting. So Codrington said that and Jung quotes him, that the Melanesian mind is entirely possessed by the belief in a supernatural power or influence called almost universally in Polynesian culture, mana. And this is what works to effect everything which is beyond the power of the ordinary man. Outside the common processes of nature, it's present in the atmosphere of life and attaches itself to persons and to things, and is manifested by results which can only be ascribed to its operation. It's a power or influence, not physical, and in a way supernatural, but it shows itself in physical force or in any kind of power or influence which a man possesses. And this mana is not fixed in anything and can be conveyed in almost anything. But spirits, whether disembodied souls or supernatural beings, have it and can impart it. And it essentially belongs to personal beings to originate it, though it may act through the medium of water or a stone or a bone. So Jung says that the concept of mana is very close to his idea of libido, psychic energy. And so the question of what to do with mana and that energy was with Jung right from the beginning, when he got interested in Freud, who thought it was sexual energy, and then their quarrel as to whether the energy was really sexual, was also a quarrel over where the mana comes from, and also a quarrel between two men who had both already tended to become mana personalities, since they, being aware of mana, acquired mana. And so there was a mana argument between them from the beginning. Now, Jung was afraid of medical power, and during the time he was doing the Red Book, he tried to move away from medical power, and he was afraid of the power that Freud was attaching to himself. And for a time, he laid low. But after he got the concept of the self, and he wrote his 2 essays in psychology, he had another bout of getting involved with the mana personality and not just on the page. And so this raises some very, very interesting questions that stay with us. I thought I wanted to do this topic because it's not often talked about, and I'd heard Sonu Shamdasani pointing out some years ago that there's hardly ever a conference in which the mana personality is talked about. So I decided to make that my topic. And lo and behold, I was rewarded by the most interesting synchronicity. After I agreed to make this topic, 2 beautiful essays were published in April of 2020 and July of 2020 in the Journal of Analytical Psychology by Giovanni Sorge, who also had heard Sonu say this very same thing and had actually made good on it by giving us the finest pair of articles that exists in the Jungian literature. And it all came out this spring, and you can find them very easily if you go online and look to the contents of the Journal of Analytical Psychology for April and July of 2020, The Construct of the Mana Personality in Jung's Works, a Historic Hermeneutic Perspective. So part 1 is in April 2020 issue of the Journal of Analytical Psychology, and the other is in July of 2020. So the question is, why are we talking about the kind of person who thinks they're in touch with mana now? And so as I began to think about it and think about my experience of Jungian analysis, starting with my own first analysis in 1965, it began. So my 55-year journey is starting with analytic training in 1970. So, and my engagement with Jungian Institutes. It seems to be a stage in the development of one's relation to the unconscious when you move from trying to take the mana of the unconscious onto yourself in what you assume is consciousness, and move instead to a recognition that the unconscious is truly unconscious, that it stays all the things it is, which I often say in lectures. It's autonomous, it's creative, it's purposive, and it's real, and you cannot own it or control it. So the concept of the mana personality is for those who unfortunately get the fantasy that the unconscious could belong to them if they were only sufficiently aware of it. So we have in power in the United States a president who wrote a book in 1975 that had a chapter called Read Jung, and that was none other than Donald Trump. And it's quite fascinating to think of his attitude towards something that he's quite famous for and quite secretive about in many ways, even though he's famous for it, his attitude toward wealth and what one can possess. And I find it absolutely fascinating that the favorite movie of Donald Trump is Citizen Kane, which is many people for many years said it was the single best sound film. These days, the palm is going to Vertigo. They've been neck and neck from the beginning. These are both films, interestingly enough, with scores by the same musical genius, Bernard Herrmann. And Orson Welles and Alfred Hitchcock often have much to do with each other in the history of cinema, but this is not about Hitchcock this time. This is going to start with Welles. What makes Citizen Kane so interesting, and it was so interesting to Donald Trump, that he was actually interviewed by our greatest documentarist who actually filmed an interview with Trump in 2002, in which Trump rather brilliantly discusses the imagery in Citizen Kane, how much it meant to him, reads it with a great deal of intelligence and interest, but concludes that Kane is generally seen as a figure who fell utterly victim to his own ego power drive, would have been fine, but for one thing. And when Errol Morris says, "What would you have advised Kane?" he said, "I would tell him to get yourself another woman." That was his solution, that his wife had been the problem, and that if he hadn't had that wife, and he would have had everything he needed. So it's a fascinating thing to imagine Trump's fantasies of how one doesn't fall into the anima problem that Jung says is at the heart also in his writings of the mana personality. So I gave Paul Antonello a picture from Citizen Kane so you can see it, because it's probably our best image of the mana personality. This is the young newspaper publisher based on, many ways, Randolph Hearst, played by Orson Welles, and he's running for governor of the state of New York. And there he is celebrating the triumphant arrival of the mana personality. There's the person behind him that he thinks is able to govern and govern his own life. Now, as the story runs, what happens is instead a tremendous tragedy. Kane has a rather innocent young woman that he's met who's utterly open and welcoming to him in a way that his own wife is not. And so they've been secretly conducting an affair, and he threatens to put his opponent in the election in jail. sound familiar? When Trump ran against Hillary Clinton, he was saying they would chant at the Republican rallies, "Lock her up." So he was saying he's going to put this person in jail. So the decision is reached by his opponent to expose the affair. And when the affair is exposed, and we're talking about an election that's taking place in the roughly even before 1920 in America, so we're really talking about a time when it would be impossible for a man who was exposed as having an extramarital affair to win an election. The newspapers say that he's been found in a love nest with Singer. So the Singer has quotes marks around it. So Kane takes it upon himself to prove that the woman is really a singer. So he takes this rather innocent woman who has a very poor, modest voice, but a very sweet, quiet personality. And he decides to use his publishing empire to present her all over America as an opera singer and to control the reviews that she gets, so that he humiliates her by having her appear again and again. One person writes a negative review, and Kane himself finishes the review to prove to everybody that his papers will not fail to tell the truth. So where everyone else is saying wonderful things, one person says a terrible thing, he completes it, publishes it. And so he absolutely robs this woman of what little voice she has, takes away her entire identity. And we watch a man actually assuming he can take complete control of a woman onto whom he's projected the anima. It's a beautiful image of what Jung is talking about, when a person feels that they're entirely on top of their own vulnerability, their own internal insecurity. And it's utterly frightening that this man who keeps possessing things that he thinks would have energy, and lots of his house, which is based on Hearst Castle in St. Simeon, they call it Xanadu in the movie, is just filled with this terrible things that have lost all their energy and interest when they become prisoners, like the woman in his house. And so we have this man who's progressively isolating himself, and from being one of the most charming young men, he becomes one of the most impossible and inflated and dehumanized old man. And he eventually dies absolutely alone after even the singer wife finally leaves him, not being able to stand his narcissism any longer. And he's absolutely alone and isolated. So this is a man who thought he could capture the unconscious and ends up literally soulless, and for trying to possess the mana, but what little power he has becomes hollow. So this is one version. I've always felt about Trump himself, I've known from the beginning, this is not going to go well for him. It's just a matter of when it doesn't go well. And what he said about getting the right woman, which as the solution, I think is no solution. So I think he's not my problem anymore, even though he's all of our problems, because I know it cannot turn out well for him. But then the question is, what about all the rest of us whom he's an avatar of, who have at different times taken the depth psychological route that if we're really smart and canny and can get onto our unconscious, the sky's really the limit. We can release all of our ambitions from inhibition. What about the rest of us? Is there any image that we have of a positive alternative to the monopersonality than the complete disaster of a Hitler, or the relative pathetic disaster of a Trump that's looming ahead? They do a lot of damage along the way, but most of all, there is that sense of having glimpsed individuation and utterly failed at it because it went into a power drive rather than into something else. So we do have another image from American cinema that offers a different mana. So Paul, would you put up the second image that I gave to you? Well, this is the throne room of The Wizard of Oz. This is now 2 years before Citizen Kane was released. This is 1939. And of course, this is the projected lantern slide image of the little man behind the curtain, who we're going to finally eventually learn is not Oz the Great and Powerful. In fact, Oz the Great and Powerful is finally laid low and forced to expose himself by Dorothy the Small and Meek with her little dog Toto in one of the most beloved films of all time. Now, here he is with the inflated mana personality image, but it doesn't seem to me at all to be an ego image. I see this more as an image of spirit from the start, and that makes me feel that it falls in another place in psyche altogether, a place in psyche that in my own work on psychological types, I've called the demon daimon with a slash, the DEMON slash DAIMON. It can either be an undermining, inflated figure, or it can be a tutelary figure that can actually cause an infusion of spirit into the psyche. So one thing that gives me hope is that for all the power display, there is no ego image in front of the spirit mana personality image. There's plenty of mana, but you don't have, as with this image of Citizen, you could leave it up for a moment, the picture for people to look at, Paul. You don't have the image of Wells himself as Kane, extending his hand in an ego way in front of the mana image. In fact, you have no human image. The little man behind the curtain has not appeared, and he's not boasting himself of the image that he's trying to project by being. So it's perfect at the end of the film, if those of you who know this film, and that's most of you, when Toto exposes the man behind the curtain, after Dorothy has done everything that Oz, the Great and Powerful, has asked her to do, and she's brought back the broomstick of the Wicked Witch of the West, and she's an authentic female hero, and he's revealed to be this little man behind the curtain projecting his image. And she said, and by then she has established a spine of integrity for the entire film and for herself by having this wonderful friend, the Scarecrow. And so you have this extroverted feeling Dorothy, heroine, and you have this introverted thinking animus figure, the Scarecrow, both of whom are decent and honest and form a spine of integrity that they can confront this extroverted thinking phony display of power. And she can say, "You're a very bad man," and the Scarecrow can say, "You humbug," and he can say, and the wizard can say, "No, I'm not a bad man. I'm just a very bad wizard." And he knows himself at that level and held to account with integrity by those two other characters, who they represent not a strong inflated ego trying to take the mana into themselves, but rather a spine of integrity that are themselves humble, able. The Scarecrow worried about his thinking, Dorothy feeling her powerlessness, but they, with their integrity, hold the mana personality to account, and the demon that has been undermining things becomes a daimon, and then in the loveliest way uses his extroverted thinking to re-energize and give spirit to the scarecrow about his insecurity about his thinking, to the Tin Woodman about his insecurity about his feeling, and to the lion about his insecurity about his courage, and enables with extroverted thinking, verbal magic, to completely reframe their anxieties as things that can be managed and that they can be good enough as human beings. So amazingly, this American country, which has been subject to so many inflations and so many problems with the monopersonality, my country seems to have produced these two films that give us a choice. They give us a choice of two routes of going with the monopersonality that Jung has talked about, both of which tell us the danger of a lack of humility and integrity, and the enormous value holding the monopersonality with integrity to do its job of inspiring us without taking its energy up into the ego. So we have this solution in fantasy. I'll be fascinated to see how our country goes. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I invite everyone to ask more questions. I have a couple of questions for you. You gave two examples of human beings with a specific sex, male. Would you give an example of Mana, that is a female? I'm thinking of Cleopatra or Hillary.
Well, forget Cleopatra for the moment. I mean, I still think that Cicero's descriptions of her, I think she had her best moment when she was portrayed by Elizabeth Taylor, as a matter of fact, but she sounded pretty dreadful. The person I would choose is the one Esther Harding chose, because it means something very important to me, which is the Thamana personality does not need to be perceived as a negative figure like Kane, like Donald Trump. That's the wrong relationship to the Mana personality. The best female example of the Mana personality is Joan of Arc. And there she never forgot that her power came from God. And so though people tried to demonize her at the time, and even treated her, as you know, like a witch burned at the stake, because she could not recant the fact that she had her own tie line to God and her own voices. And as much good as they had done for the consolidation of royal power, they didn't want someone claiming this much religious authority in what was almost prematurely a Protestant way, where one has one's own conscience and listens to it rather than to the authority of the church. The church eventually admitted its mistake and canonized her, and we have the trials and everything. But there is someone who was a Mana personality because she really was in touch with something that was great, and it had a charismatic and rallying effect on others. The Jungian analyst Esther Harding cited her as an example of a Mana personality in her book, Psychic Energy. And there's no feeling that the Mana personality is necessarily a dangerous inflation. It's simply an awareness that some people are in touch with enough of the divine that one actually feels the energy with them. We don't have to take that away from them or assume that they're dangerously inflated or burn them as witches or demonize them for recognizing their greatness. I think the key is whether it becomes a terrible power drive. Now, you mentioned Cleopatra. I think unfortunately, toward the end, it rather did become her wish, but she was doing it for her country, Egypt. She was trying to keep Egyptian civilization alive. So she would take first first Caesar and then Mark Antony, to try to keep Egypt safe under Roman rule. So she had at least her country beyond her, and she ended up taking her own life in the end. But she would be a monopersonality, and Shakespeare certainly gives her her due. Age cannot wither her, nor custom stale her infinite variety. So again, we have to speak well of the monopersonality before we simply speak ill of it, because the I Ching says it perfectly. If you want to compress something, you have to first let it fully expand. There's nothing wrong with the inflation as long as one has the integrity to do something about it in the end.
Let me ask you. My daughter passed by, so I want to say hello to Olivia if she's around. I have a question about inflation, integrity, and you're a bad man. No, I am a bad wizard. Or you're a bad husband. No, I'm a bad cheater. Or you're a bad wife or mother. No, blah, blah, blah. When does the mana personality, the inflation, actually, and the mistake, the loss of integrity, helps transformation, helps to unblock something that has been blocked for such a long time, that something so bad, so violent, could actually provoke a good transformation?
Well, the Christian answer is without sin, there is no redemption. And so we have to make a pretty colossal mistake. I mean, it goes back to the way the look on the face of Adam and Eve in Masasio's painting as they're being led away from a paradise is one of the greatest, if not the greatest painting in Western art in terms of getting hold of the shame. It depends on whether or not there's a capacity for shame after an inflation has injured someone else. What's so shocking about Citizen Kane is how shameless he is. And I don't think you cure that kind of shame by getting a different woman.
No.
I think it's very. I think that is. So I look with people not for an ability to stay always humble, but some capacity to hold shame and to embrace shame. And I have to notice in The Wizard of Oz that once the wizard confesses that he's a bad wizard, Dorothy and the Scarecrow do not pile on. They welcome what help he can give. And that's also important, that they do not keep reminding him of all the damage he's done. So there has to be a combination of humility and compassion and a recognition that we all get inflated. We all have a mana personality. We are either projecting it on someone, which is a mistake, or we're being it ourselves, which is a mistake. There has to be that moment where we meet it with integrity and self-forgiveness and move on. That the combination is very, very powerful. There's something like this last scene of the film Rashomon, where the priest and the if you've ever seen that, it's about two men holding each other's shame. It's Japan holding its shame at the end of for having started World War II in the East, and the ability to hold shame. It's what I feel right now about the Black Lives Matter movement. That's why I feel so strongly that America should pay reparations for slavery. I feel if America can hold its shame, it would be enough. It would be enough. We could move on, and authority would mean something again. You can't have authority if you don't hold yourself accountable. So I believe in shame. I'm sad to say that many people come to therapy hoping to have their shame removed. I try to help people find their shame and see it's their friend. That's core to integrity for me.
What you said, holding each other's shame, perhaps as an opportunity of reparation and of moving on, whatever that means. We have more questions. Could Greta Thunberg be a mana personality? Could we think of Greta in terms of mana personality?
Yeah, yes, I think, I mean, I want to be very careful as an analyst not to go around diagnosing people. You know, Jung once said to a young man, he said, whose father wanted him to see him. He was 19, and Jung told the father, well, he suffers from a hypertrophy of intellectual intuition. The young man was furious that Jung would diagnose him and say, look, what are you talking about? You have the same problem Immanuel Kant had, Schopenhauer had, and that I have. What's the matter here? So when I say, okay, is she a mana personality? Of course she's a mana personality. She's got the energy of the Great Mother, aware of what's happening to Gaia, the Earth Mother. Now, the Great Mother is a mana personality, and many therapists who become unusually matriarchal can be just as much a mana personality as therapists who are unusually patriarchal. And there can be a matriarchal abuse that's too containing and too compassionate. So of course, but she's a young woman carrying the spirit of the mother. I've been seeing dreams all over the world where I consult with people where the mother in every country of the world have shown up in dreams in trouble, with the mother principles in trouble. I see the images. It's almost like I'm in my very first 5 minutes of Jungian analysis, where the forgotten feminine is everywhere in symbolized in people. So that was before the pandemic. So I was glad to see her come forward with a connection. But if she thinks she's the Great Mother, and she were to go that way, then you'd have the situation of the leader who doesn't know herself, and that would be a problem. I don't believe she's that imperfect. I think and I don't find her that proud. So yes, she has a mana personality, but she needs to have that. We need her in that role. We need to also help her not carry that in ways that are not good for her.
And I would say we also we'll have to let her grow and develop. She's a very wise human being, but she's under 20. Imagine if we as a collective society, we can support her and not only go against her, as many people do from the right-wing side, but support her and grow and develop to really fulfill her mission.
That, but also not inflate her from the left-hand side. I mean, and that's the other side of that coin. So, yes, she needs to know her limits, and perhaps she does. And again, the mana, that some people have mana at a certain time is a wonderful opportunity for them and for us. We should not abuse them.
We have many questions, John. I think we make an agreement. We go much beyond the hour. I don't care if you feel fit, because we have
a little bit more. Yes, I can
a little bit
more. So, I have enough time to do that. Yes.
Okay. Can we do any comparison between narcissistic personality and mana personality?
That's a very interesting question that I haven't a good answer for. Part of the problem is that we don't know enough. We have Kohut's work on narcissism. I would like to offer someone we don't hear enough about these days as an alternative, much as I admire Kohut and admire Jung and admire Alfred Adler, all of whom have spoken to this issue in different ways. The person I'd like to mention is Karen Horney.
Yeah.
And she made a distinction that in her work on the neurotic personality in our time between something she called narcissism, which she felt really was different from what she called self-idealization. And I think I'm trying to get at the difference in even these examples. And I'm still trying to decide which is which. And so I can't really give you an easy conceptual answer. But I think, I guess specifically with Kane, we're particularly talking about malignant narcissism. And there, I think we're looking at something, I think I'm going to differ slightly from Horney now. I would call this, well, maybe I'm not differing from her. She would not see that as exactly compensatory. She would see that as the very malignant outcome of terrible low self-esteem and actual continuous suffering. There you don't actually have an absence of shame, even if the person can look as if they have no shame. What you have is a person for whom even shame is a luxury they can't afford because they're so miserable. When I look at Donald Trump, I see one thing about him is that he looks incredibly unhappy in his very face. I call him the gargoyle. He looks terribly unhappy. And he has an absolute genius for putting that unhappiness in absolutely everyone and everything he touches. America has never been more unhappy than since he became our president. There's not been a day in which we haven't had the unhappiness of having him around. And some people do that. They create, everything is spoiled. Everything is ruined. Everything is made harder. And I can only imagine how hard the man must be who has to do this to us all. So that to me is a very malignant form of narcissism. Self-idealization may be something very different. And that's what I'm not saying it's not also neurotic, but at least one is holding the ideal somewhere. And then the job is to say, maybe it's not me, but the ideal continues to exist. And the ideal is good, and I don't have to make myself the ideal. And I think that's what Jung is talking about when he talks about getting over God almightiness and God likeness and trying to come down from that kind of inflation. I think the beauty of Jung, by contrast, is that although there's no doubt that he mythologized and idealized his own individuation and was pretty excited by it, there's another part of him that was continually getting inflated by this archetype that he discovered and that archetype, and then coming down from the inflation. The analyst Elizabeth Osterman once said, who met him in Osterman, she was an analyst in the Jungian Institute of San Francisco, and she's known for one major paper that she wrote on the tendency toward patterning and order and matter in the psyche, but she was a very good analyst. And she said that she admired so much about Jung is that he had so many inflations. And as he discovered one thing after another, each of the archetypes, he identified with them. As he said, you had to. You can realize what an archetype is till you've lived it and identified with it, and then could pull back from it and come back down to being human. And I think that's really true. I think he stayed human. And especially at the end of his life, one gets a feeling that he remained a human being. And I think that's a very, very good thing. He could always go back to that. I think some people with malignant narcissism have long since failed to sign the human contract and are not planning to do so. And they're the ones that put their suffering at not being human enough into the rest of us. And that, to me, is their tragedy, but it's also our misfortune. So I see a big difference between the problem of self-idealization, which is only solved by realizing that we are not the self. The ego is not the self. That essential Jungian discrimination. That's
on this, John, let me move on, if you don't mind. You see, your question was very, very interesting, and John could keep on this for hours. I think there is a question about what you said about shame and hands going hands in hands, does shame need to come accompanied by honesty? So I guess confession, or self-shame, being ashamed of oneself, but hiding, not confessing from the rest, from those that you have affected, would be enough to develop and move on?
Well, you know, you can be extremely tedious. I mean, obviously, in the what I utterly respect, the 12-step programs, Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Gamblers Anonymous, and I've had patients in my practice who are doing the 12 steps, who are sponsors. I love what AA does. And in fact, it was one of Jung's patients who, ex-patients, who was the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. But they say it's very important to make amends to people that you wrong, unless you're making amends are going to actually do more harm than good. And there's nothing more exhausting for other people than you insisting on making your apology to them. And so I think it's not holding shame is pretty hard to do entirely alone, but it's not other people's purpose in life to receive your confession. And so you have to kind of respect that confession is essential in many ways, and at the same time, it needs to be contained. And so the Catholic Church has a specific way of holding that right. Therapy has a specific way. But I don't think that a kind of endless public apology is actually an entirely attractive way to hold shame.
Perhaps a good way is the difference between the Catholic Church or the Catholic countries and the Protestant countries. When one is found guilty in a Catholic country, like mine, Italy, you don't go in front of the judge. Of course, you go in front of the judge, you get sentenced, and then humiliation starts. While in a Protestant country, you go in front of the judge, you pay, you go to jail, and when you leave jail, you're free. There is a difference in this. But I want to move on with a very, very interesting question from Brazil again, from Idalina. Do you think that Jung, when he wrote the 7 sermons, he was in contact with his mana personality?
Well, did Jung write the 7 sermons, or as the Red Book tells us, did Philemon write it? He found Philemon in it, and you see, my work on typology helps me. We are one of the ways that we get into trouble with the mana personality and do things that we're ashamed of is that we're all dissatisfied with our psychological type, because we have 8 functions of consciousness, and if anybody who could use all 8, and some people in art seem to be able to do that, like William Shakespeare, we would all be extraordinary people with this fabulous range, and we would be supremely competent in our management of at least our art form, or hopefully many of our dealings with people, and we could feel pretty good about ourselves. It's a lovely ideal. But the reality is that our typology limits us to 1 or 2 preferred functions that we even feel interested enough to develop if we're lucky, and if we have the identity to know who we are and are not still living out our parents' wishes for us, as so many of us are, our societies or schools, but can actually have the chance to be ourselves. And we all have this problem of the inferior function. So we're all very limited people. So that's when we kind of want to draw on these extensive loans from the unconscious that we will take from our mana personality or anywhere else, our trickster, or lots of other places in ourselves that we can draw upon to buttress ourselves. And we have to be very, we have to be careful of how much we draw out that isn't really ours to match that standard. So what I think we have to do is get over the big addiction, which Marianne Woodman, when she was alive, used to say was the master addiction of all, which is addiction to perfection.
Oh, yeah.
I do think the imitation of Christ has been a very damaging thing in that regard, because it, and this also this Protestant spirit that is similar, even the Platonic spirit, every day in every way I'm going to be better and better, I'm going to do my best. Very dangerous. I think the problem is to accept our lopsidedness for what it is, and not try so very hard to get it all right. And that way, we can constantly confess to each other, as the wizard says, I'm not a very good wizard. I mean, the truth is I've been hiding from you. You didn't see me who as I really am, because there's not much to see. And he didn't have the solution to everything. Somehow that's the place we've got to find it in us to get to. It's a post-heroic place, but I think that would do us a lot of good. That's
The last,
answer to the question.
The last question is exactly about this. I like what you said about not being perfect and not even being sinless, without sin. We all sin on every day. And the last question, while I say hello to my daughter Olivia, I haven't been seeing her since Saturday, so hello Ollie, and she's back on the screen. The last question from Paul. Paul, step in if I don't read it right. Several major leaders are mana personality who are so damaged and facing the reality of a pandemic. Bolsonaro, Trump, Boris Johnson, and we can go on. What about?
I wouldn't call all of those. I don't see Boris Johnson as much of a mana personality.
No, as a damaged human being, perhaps.
Yes.
No, damage. That my addiction is not Paul. What about the drama of a mana personality facing death, infinity, and the universe, and taking care of others?
Well,
blame Paul, not me.
We all have.
The question is itself inflated. I can see that.
Well, but it moves toward it. Here's a mana personality question from you, so from a soul inside you that's the mana personality that is inflated and should be. The best example of the value of that inflation, the most exquisite example, Paul, of why what you're saying is why I don't want to extinguish the mana personality in any of us, is that it asks enough of us. The great postmodern moral philosopher, who many people who know philosophy far better than I have said is the greatest moral philosopher of our time, is the post-Holocaust French Jewish phenomenologist Emmanuel Levinas. And he upended everything in the Western tradition about integrity, my subject that I'm very interested in, by saying, not as Cicero said, that, we have a conflict, or Freud in his own way, we have a conflict of duties, and we have to give this much to that duty and that much to the other. And so which gets translated in the Jungian view, that you have that you have to give to yourself, and you have that you give to the other, or render under Caesar those things that are Caesar's, and to God those things that are God's. The idea of the balance of payments, or the balance between nationalism and globalism, it's a very seductive idea. Here's Levinas, comes in the middle of all that and says, first of all, epistemology, what's true is not first philosophy, and weighing and balancing moral obligations is not first philosophy. Ethics is first philosophy, and what he means by ethics is defined, he says, is that we all have an infinite responsibility to the other. So there's the inflation of the monopersonality saying, there's no end to what we owe each other. So with that gives me the courage to say that since shame is a problem for absolutely all of us, we all owe each other everything we can give to the process of holding each other in our shame. And when I do that as a human being for other people, which I do on a daily basis, I find a tremendous reciprocity. They hold me in my shame, and it's amazing how well it works. We saw it in political life in South Africa with Truth and Reconciliation. That cannot have been easy on either side. And I mean, for all the reasons we know, imagine people who enable torturers and actual torturers to meet either the victims or the families of their victims and talk about it in dialogue. But so I believe in dialogue, and I believe in dialogue holding each other in shame. And I think my mana personality tells me that you can ask that much of all of us. And that's, so I accept the infinite obligation to the other.
Comment from Nomi. She's saying about your comment to the Septem Sermones. Jung was listening to the gods, not identifying. Then I guess she's also answering to my question about the confession. Find the person to whom to confess, be it communal or individual.
That's important. I don't think there's a phrase a friend of mine uses, you can tell a good person anything. And I agree with that. But for each of us, who that good person is part of our quest. We have to find that good person. And I mean outside ourselves. We might be able to find that good person in ourselves. Wouldn't that be nice to be the person to whom one could tell anything? That's the nice idea of nothing human is alien to me that we all therapists try to practice. But I have always found people that I can tell things to. Jung said that there were only two people he could have an uncomplicated conversation with in his formative years. One was William James, and the other was Theodore Flournoy. Everyone else, the conversation quickly got complicated. In other words, the complex came out. Freud being no exception, of course. And, you know, it's luck if you ever find one or two such people, but if you have them, you can tell them anything. And then you can decide whether many times you don't need to tell them much. Those people you should talk to.
Thank you, John. As always, you're amazing. And the job, the work you did is simply amazing. We thank you. We were more than 75. We could keep on for hours, but we have to stop because you have a busy agenda. It's very late here in Europe. And thank you. Stay healthy, even maybe stay wealthy. And for everybody else, we will see you on August 12th with Joel Croker, Jungian. Let me take the title. Oh, I lost it. Sorry, just 1 second. No, I lost it. Jung and music. Good night, everyone. Good night, John.
Good night. Thank you for being here.